I'm talking with Josh Finley, Director of the Election Protection Project. And before we get into the conversation, let's talk about what that is, the Election Protection Project.
So the Election Protection Project is a project of the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and we work on election integrity. And even though we are based in Texas, we really focus on election integrity in the battleground states. So Georgia, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Arizona, Nevada, and Michigan. And we are focused on improving election process in those states. We want to make sure that everybody that is legally able to cast a vote can, and that those ballots are cast, counted, and tabulated in a proper way.
So when President Trump and the pillow guy are talking about election fraud, and we're going to get to the heart of this, you're the guy that's looking into it.
That's exactly right. We are looking at it from all angles on those states. And one thing that we're doing that is unique is we are looking at this well before the election. Mm-hmm. We are focused on this. I mean, we started really on the ground in 2023 for a 2024 race. Because one thing we learned in 2020 is that there are a lot of systemic problems that need to be fixed with our election process. And this is not a last minute file a lawsuit and hope for the best kind of thing.
Right.
We really want to get in there with election administrators and fix an election process so people can have confidence that their vote will count.
Let's talk about perhaps what we were talking about earlier, misinformation that's out there. People think that one thing is going on when there are other things going on.
Well, so that's exactly right. One thing that you heard following 2020 is that the media said there's no election fraud. Right? They just said there's nothing to see here. There's no problems with this election. And a lot of the reasons for that are some people are making claims about election fraud that they couldn't necessarily substantiate, or the data wasn't there, or it was really complex to look at. And what that did was it kind of drew the attention away from very real issues of election fraud. We held a podcast the other day with an assistant attorney general of the state of Texas who went through just a list of election fraud things that were out there, but they weren't Chinese machines flipping votes.
They weren't the things we were talking about.
That's exactly right. The big issues in our election process these days are really a lot more basic. They're things like, do the machines work when you're supposed to show up and vote? Is your voting location open? Do you have the correct ballot? Does it have the correct races on it? And will that ballot scan and count properly? Are you able to observe the ballots through the chain of custody process, from when a ballot is cast through when it is run through a machine and then tabulated? Is there a secure chain of custody so we have confidence that all of the ballots are going through that process and nothing else is being added in? These are the types of issues that really cause problems in our elections. But because they're not what people talk about, maybe they're not the most glamorous issues.
Sexy, yeah.
That's right. They don't get a lot of attention, and they really allow some members of the media to say there's no fraud, there's nothing to see, and that's just not true.
Now, just to clarify, the former president has filed some 60 cases, lost all of them, or none of the rulings were substantial. Were you involved in any of those kinds of investigations, or did anyone at Dominion come to you and say, hey, we need you to look into this? Or what was your involvement in those things that the folks do hear about?
Sure. So that's a great question. So I was a lawyer on the Trump campaign in 2020. I was not involved in filing any of those lawsuits. And you can read about a lot of the things that we worked on. What I was involved in, though, is I ran the President's Election Day War Room out of the White House. So we had lawyers spread out throughout the country, and they would report in issues that they saw with elections, and then we would take those issues to the President's General Counsel and campaign manager and to the President himself, and they would make decisions on how to resolve those issues. Also post-Election Day, and you can read about this now, I mean, it's written about in, I think, the Washington Post, the campaign spent millions of dollars paying consultants to look for election fraud and things like that. So the campaign did a great job investigating all of the claims out there. One of the big issues with those lawsuits, though, is they just couldn't get a day in court. The courts were very interested in finality, right? That's an issue with all lawsuits in our country, right? Is, you have to compromise getting to the truth with just holding a deadline, because you can't have legal issues hanging out there forever, right? And so I would say there's a lot out there that we really don't know about 2020. There were certainly some lawsuits that were hard to substantiate, right? You can read the pleadings and know that on the face of them. But some maybe needed to be investigated further, but the time has passed for that. And we really need to look forward now to how do we give people confidence in the process going forward.
Speaking of which, we still have hanging from all of that these fake elector. It's been called the fake elector scheme,
Right.
But I think there's 6 states now that are looking into that. Is that tangential to what you do, or are you involved in those kinds of investigations as well?
No, so that's a little bit different than what we do, and that is kind of tangential. You know, that fake elector thing, it's gotten so twisted and blown up in the judicial system and in the media, in my opinion. Right. One thing about it is those fake electors weren't trying to hide anything. You know, there's a case from Hawaii in 1960 where Democrats filed fake electors when there were alternate electors. Right. It's important that we use the right vocabulary.
Sure.
Alternate electors when there were still disputes with the election to preserve those electors' votes if a court ruled, for whatever reason, that there was a controversy in the election and maybe the other side won.
And that sounds legitimate. Some of the electors in these cases have said, "Well, we just weren't informed. We didn't know everything we were doing." And is that a legitimate reason for how this thing played out?
You know, I think it absolutely is. And some of them even wrote on their elector forms that these were alternate elector votes to preserve the vote in case something happened. You know, I think a lot of what this was it was happening last minute. It may not have been the cleanest process ever, and so there wasn't a lot of education going out there. It wasn't maybe clear to everybody. But they were so public about it that I don't think you could call it, you know, fake or fraudulent electors in any way.
Well, I guess we'll find out as those things progress through the courts.
That's right.
Looking forward, though, are you still at this point working for the campaign to kind of establish things in Texas? Are these other states that you were talking about?
No, so I'm not working for the campaign right now. What we are really focused on is more of a permanent infrastructure for election integrity. You know, the thing about campaigns is when that campaign ends, everybody leaves, right? You either win and they take a government job, or you lose and everybody finds something else to do. What I'm really focused on here is sustainable election integrity improvement.
Interesting.
What I want to do is I want to look at the process across election cycles, not just presidential cycles, but also midterm cycles and, you know, big and small races. And it just takes time to be able to dive into that. And so I really want to make that the focus.
Let me ask you if it is at all a part of your process, and specifically with voters of color who have said, well, we're disenfranchised in these ways because they're closing precincts or we're getting information at the last minute. And this is coming from predominantly Black and Hispanic communities. And I'm wondering if that's part of the mindset when you take on this election protection, that those communities are considered as well.
So absolutely we want those communities to be considered. And we want to we want to make sure that everybody that is legally eligible to vote can vote easily and fairly and safely. You know, part of what I see as the issue here is we've politicized a lot of basic counting functions in the election process that should be very basic, you know. To some extent, voting is just a transaction between a person and their government. You know, you mark something, you turn in a paper ballot, whatever it is, and you expect the government to count that. And we do that millions of times a day. We have that transaction with Walmart, for example, right? And we pay with paper, we pay with plastic, we pay electronically, we pay with a combination, and we trust that the right amount is going to be taken out of our bank account and put in Walmart's bank account, right? It happens correctly most of the time. We need to implement those best practices in our voting because so much of what we are doing is we are just we are telling the government how we want a vote to be counted, and we expect it to be counted correctly.
Exactly.
But because we've politicized so much of the basic, almost accounting parts of an election, we've gotten away from that. And we really need to get back to some of those basic best practices.
You talk about politicizing, and I read it, a couple of your articles, you talked about the use of what's the name of it? The folks who come and observe.
Yes.
In the polling places. And there's a feeling among some voters that that's a little intimidating. How do you balance that?
Well, so most laws have those poll watchers in place so that they are watching the process. You know, in some states, maybe they're where the voters are casting their votes, but every voter should have privacy in casting that vote. Those observers more come into play when the vote has been cast, the voter has left the facility, but those ballots are taken out of the machines where they were cast in and they're run through the tabulators, or the cards that they have voted on are scanned in the tabulation machines. That's where the observers are more meaningful. When we talk about meaningful access, it's being able to see how those ballots are cast and counted after the voter has left the facility.
That's interesting. We were talking about Texas. On the intimidation side, for lack of a better word, when you have people who are armed, militia-looking guys hanging out at the poll place, watching people going in, is that overboard or is that part of the protection?
No, I mean, that's overboard. People with guns outside of a polling place, there's just no place for that. You know, it often comes up in drop boxes, for example, because there are rules about guns, for example, in a government facility, right? A lot of voting happens in a Board of Elections office or a school or a post office, and you already can't take guns in there, right? Where it becomes more of an issue is in drop boxes, for example, in states that have those. And no, nobody should be intimidated for voting. That's the last thing that we want to have happen. What should happen, though, is a clear chain of custody process with those ballots after they've been cast.
Yes. I think that was what they were arguing over in Nevada about the custody of those boxes,
That's exactly
those votes.
right.
You mentioned something else about mail-in voting. The former president has spoken out, suggesting that is that there's fraud associated with that. But on the flip side, maybe the GOP could have gotten a better result had they taken advantage of the mail-in voting, and that's been a lot of the discussion. What's your take on that?
Well, so mail-in voting is not the most secure form of voting, definitely. But a lot of that has to do with the rules on the front end about who can get a ballot. In 2020, it was a big issue because a lot of states implemented universal mail-in voting. In other words, everyone on the voter roll got a ballot. And the truth is, facilities just weren't able to process that many ballots because they'd never had to do it before. You know, we looked at Bucks County, Pennsylvania, for example, and they had gone from just a small number of mail-in voting to this massive number. And so after Election Day, they just had stacks of ballots loose in their elections office.
Wow.
They were scanning them as quick as they could, but they had no other place to put them. That kind of voting is really insecure. What we've learned since then, though, is when you're not in a COVID atmosphere, we don't want voters to wait until Election Day to cast their vote. I mean, look, we always want people to vote in person with an ID. But if you can get out and cast that vote early, you can be sure that it happened. Most secretaries of state office have a website that you can go to show that you've tabulated your vote. If you got questions, you can resolve that early. I mean, yes, we want people to go vote early, whether it's early in person, whether it's mail voting, whatever it is. Vote early. Make sure that your vote is cast properly. But yeah, we want to get away from as much mail-in voting as possible, but there is definitely a place for it when it's done in a secure way.
Okay. I'm sure we won't resolve that debate over voter fraud today or here. But for those watching on Politics in Color who say, you know what, I value my right to vote and I want to get out there to vote and I don't want anything to stand in the way, what would you tell them about their concerns about voter fraud? Are those concerns legitimate?
Well, what I would say is, first of all, go vote. The worst thing that can happen is to sit out an election because you think your vote won't count, right? The easiest way to make sure your vote doesn't count is to stay home. So always go vote. The second thing is get involved in the process. I've got a saying that I've written on my board, and it's been there for 3 years now since I've been working on election integrity, that says you can find a conspiracy anywhere if you don't understand how things work. Get involved and become part of the process. Did you know that anyone can apply? If you live in your county, you can apply to be a poll worker. You can be there as a worker. It's just a part-time job, but you can go handle the ballots in your elections office. You can be part of the team that is, maybe verifying signatures or running the ballots through the tabulator machines, and you can see exactly what happens. And I would highly encourage that. And if you don't have that time, become an official poll watcher. Be one of those people that's observing the ballots through the process, like we've talked about, because you can see how our elections really run, and it'll just make all the difference in the world in your understanding.
Of course, poll workers need to be I guess, are mindful of the attitude toward poll workers nowadays is not quite as friendly as it used to be, but nonetheless a very responsible thing to do, and I would certainly encourage folks who are thinking about that to do that. Josh Finley, thanks for joining us and giving us some insight into the election protection process, and have a great day.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
We will be back here on Politics in Color right after this.